BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone is well. In this episode I will be talking all about Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and I will be exploring the material that is in the book Jack the Poet Was Francis Thompson Jack the Ripper by Simon Webb. Now, longtime Black Box Online Radio followers will remember that last year, in the spring of 2023, I did a standalone episode called Jack the Ripper Suspect Francis Thompson, but that was mostly talking about the observations that had been made by an individual named Richard Patterson, who has his own book out about Francis Thompson being Jack the Ripper called Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson. And I've explored Richard Patterson's material a lot, and when I did the weekly segment, the Jack the Ripper Report here on Black Box Online Radio, I referenced numerous pieces of commentary from Richard Patterson, and I think that he is a very intelligent individual. I think he has made a very, very good effort at putting together this narrative on how Francis Thompson could have been Jack the Ripper. But I knew that there was this other book out there by Simon Webb called Jack the Poet, and I wanted to read it and just see his take on the subject. And I can talk a little bit about some of the profiling issues, which I'll get to later on in the episode, but I want to begin with the most basic introduction to today's topic, and that is that Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery, and it did indeed go on to become the world's most famous unsolved murder mystery. Now, 5 women were murdered in England during that crime spree between August 31st to November 9th of 1888. Whatever happened before or after that really is hard to pin down. And Francis Thompson is more famous for being a poet and writer rather than being a Jack the Ripper suspect. And I'm not going to lie to you guys. When I first learned about Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect, I thought it was a dead end. I thought it was going to be something such as grabbing at straws, or that there would be either this type of mindset where you'd have to fit a square peg through a circular hole, where just everything would have to be some type of stretch, or maybe, just maybe, if you were to read his poetry a certain way, you'd find these types of clues, and I don't really think highly of those types of investigations. However, to the credit of Simon Webb and Richard Patterson, the investigation into Francis Thompson takes a very, very different turn, and it really isn't so much about that. Now, I will be honest with you guys. If you were to put Francis Thompson, Jack the Ripper into Google, you might get sent to the Wikipedia page, and it will say that the theory involving Francis Thompson being Jack the Ripper deals with Richard Patterson looking at Francis Thompson's poetry and using certain interpretations of it to indicate that he was Jack the Ripper. That's what you might find easily. But I think that that is an oversimplification, and not only that, it is an unfair oversimplification, because Simon Webb and Richard Patterson have put forward a very interesting circumstantial case. Note that I didn't say it's an absolutely perfect and compelling circumstantial case, but it is rather fascinating and enthralling. Let's look at some major points. As previously stated, Jack the Ripper operated in 1888. Francis Thompson was born in 1859, so he would have been just shy of his 30th birthday before the Whitechapel murder, or during the Whitechapel murders. He would have been just shy of his 30th birthday, and this is rather interesting because there is a psychological profile that was created by the FBI profiler John Douglas about Jack the Ripper, who definitely estimates his age as being close to 30. So that's one thing. Francis Thompson was also someone who had a very bizarre type of educational experience. Simon Webb goes into this in great detail in the book when he talks about Francis Thompson was someone who was a very good student when he was younger. He excelled at English and Latin particularly, and he also went to seminary. And when I said went to seminary, he went to a religious studies boarding school, and he also went to a Catholic boarding school, and later on in life he tries to become a priest. So let's just separate those two issues. When he's at the Catholic boarding school, one of the fathers there even stated that Francis Thompson wrote one of the best compositions that he had ever read from an English student, and he was a very good student in languages, English and Latin. But there was this line in Simon Webb's book when he said that the success in the classroom does not translate to success in the workplace. And part of me was just thinking, that's like hearing it from a motivational speaker just shouting down at you. It's like, all right, let's say it again. Success in the classroom does not translate to success in the workplace. Because Francis Thompson seems like someone who is very thoughtful, very introspective, very sensitive. That's another one. Introverted. Definitely not the most sociable person. But in class, he was well behaved, and he was someone who was just very apt when it came to reading, very high reading level. But the elements that he experienced in his life do match up with that, a lot of what going to be experienced by serial killers. He was bullied a lot, and Simon Webb does put excerpts of Francis Thompson's own writing, talking about how he was bullied at school, and he was tormented, and he refers to the bullies as the tormentors, and he states that there was no conceivable reason about why they were tormenting him. There was no reason in Francis Thompson's mind about why they were choosing to bully him, but they were targeting him. And Simon Webb even postulates that perhaps it's because of Francis Thompson's own natural vulnerabilities and sensitivities, and I think that's most likely accurate, just talking about other types of true crime cases here on this channel. So not only is he bullied, but he is also someone who is exposed to a lot of violence in his early life. As previously stated, he was born in 1859, and in 1868, he was living in Ashton-under-Lyne in England, and in 1868 they experienced the Ashton riots, where Protestants began attacking Catholics during these riots. And Francis Thompson was a Catholic surrounded by Protestants. And this is something that both Simon Webb and Richard Patterson talk about when they say that he would have been exposed to violence in the name of a religious cause. And I'm not going to lie to you guys. I went into looking into Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect, thinking that this was just going to be, perhaps some interesting discussions, but I didn't think it was going to go anywhere. And then I had a very big reversal. I was really quite impressed with the presentations. And back when I did the Jack the Ripper suspect ratings episode, I put Francis Thompson as one of the top 4 suspects most likely to have been Jack the Ripper. And then I had to move him down lower on the notch, taking him out of that top 4. And the reason for that was, I was watching an interview with Richard Patterson, and he was talking all about how Francis Thompson was a Catholic. At one point in life, he even tries to become a priest, but he was a very deeply religious man, and the concept of prostitution would have offended him. And the women who were attacked by Jack the Ripper in 1888 were ladies of the night. They were sex workers. They were full of that profession. I know it's disputed by some, but I believe that they were. And, I mean, that is something that I just thought was nonsensical when I first heard it. I thought it was ludicrous. The fact that, this is a deeply religious guy, and he's offended by prostitution, so what is he going to resort to? Murder? What is he going to resort to? Physical violence? I mean, like, everything that he should have been learning is all about thou shalt not kill, love thy neighbor as thyself. And I just thought that was absolutely ridiculous, that is how they would put together this theory on how this deeply religious person is going to become Jack the Ripper because he's offended by prostitution for religious reasons. So, as I said, I pulled Francis Thompson down, but Simon Webb does explore that exact subject in the book, Jack the Poet, when he says that story about the Ashton riots, that he learned from an early age that violence can be done in the name of religion, and I'm not trying to start a debate or anything, this is just the material that's in the book. And then it goes a step further, saying that when he's sent to the Catholic boarding school during his older youth years, that he is just exposed to a lot of stories of, bloodshed and violence that are coming directly from the teachings at the Catholic boarding school. Things about Jesus on the cross and bleeding, even stuff like that is, stories of violence. And this is, again, Simon Webb's observation, not mine. But here's the thing that relates more to serial killers, and that is that not only was Francis Thompson bullied and tormented when he's at various different schools, he is also the victim of beatings from the staff and the headmasters, and they are, and sometimes it's described as beatings, and other times it's described as canings, like being struck with a cane. So there's a lot of physical abuse that he experienced in his youth. And one thing that Francis Thompson did was he would withdraw. Like, I remember our presentation from Richard Patterson when he was talking about how Francis Thompson would build these little forts in the library and just kind of be secluded from other people. And in my mind, I was kind of conceiving how kids would do that with pillows or seat cushions or something like that. But Simon Webb talks about it directly in the book, Jack the Poet, when he says that he was actually using books. He's actually making piles of books in a library and just has this little enclosure so he can be separated from other people. And you might be wondering, well, okay, if this guy's an extreme introvert, well, how on earth did he go on to become a literary great and a poet? Like, how do people discover him at all? Not all people like that even get recognized. For example, with Emily Dickinson, they learned about a lot of her poems after her death that she wrote mostly for herself, and she would just wrap them up almost like presents, tie a ribbon around the poem, and she would keep them for her own private readings or just having them. And that's how they were discovered after she passed away. Well, Francis Thompson does share his writings with the world, and he became somewhat recognized because of a composition that he had written about an individual named William Booth. And that isn't a name that I recognized immediately, but because Simon Webb shared a little bit more information, you might recognize the name The Salvation Army. William Booth was the founder of the Salvation Army, and Francis Thompson wrote a counterpiece or some type of counter-argument to a publication that had been written by William Booth, and it was recognized and well-revered and commended. As previously stated, he was an excellent student and an excellent writer, and he was someone who was heavily regarded by his superiors and contemporaries as being a good writer, so that's something that stood out. But in addition to the psychological profiling elements, Francis Thompson also attempts suicide in 1887 because of various issues. I think mostly it's just perhaps that he was dealing with certain types of emotional stress partnered with drug addiction. And this is, again, the stuff that I thought, I mean, like, how would you reconcile that with just, well, this is a deeply religious man who's offended by prostitution who goes on to become Jack the Ripper, also attempting suicide in 1887, which would have been a sin, would it not? And there's actually a story about how he gets really high on drugs, almost to the point where he's trying to kill himself, and he just has this vision of a writer named Thomas Chattering talking to him and almost talking him out of going through with the suicide completely, or just saying that something to the effect of greatness will come to you if you stay alive. And, you know, it's a good story. As I said, there's so many good stories in this, and that ultimately makes him want to keep living. But you just see all of these things that don't quite seem like they're in complete balance. And I think, though, that I had to admit that I was somewhat critical of Simon Webb and Richard Patterson for that type of thinking that, oh, a deeply religious guy couldn't have these types of contradictory beliefs. They happen all the time. Lots of people do crimes in the name of religion and morality and ethics and all of that. And more importantly, people who are experiencing psychotic disorders or they have serial killer tendencies frequently have contradictory beliefs where they know that what they're doing is illegal, but they are still choosing to do it because they believe there's some type of justification. Even if they know that it's morally wrong, they are still going to go through with it because they believe that they are entitled to that behavior. And it's something to the effect of, well, this person was wrong to me, did something wrong to me, so I'm going to do something to settle the score. I'm going to teach that person a lesson. And Pat Brown talks about this in the book Killing for Sport, about how serial killers might not comprehend things exactly as, well, I was traumatized in my youth and now I'm going to get revenge on society. Instead, she thinks that they would more articulate it in their own mind as, oh, someone was mean to me, I'm going to teach that bitch a lesson. And that's almost a direct quotation from Pat Brown's book, Killing for Sport. And, I mean, people have contradictory beliefs all the time. People believe that they are entitled to act in violent ways all the time when we look at serial killer stories, mass shooters, other true crime cases. So maybe I was overly critical of just saying that that was a ridiculous and ludicrous statement about how and why this guy could have gone on to become Jack the Ripper. Now, you also might be wondering, Jack the Poet, what other types of connections would Francis Thompson have to the Jack the Ripper case? And, I mean, he is someone who was trying to become a doctor. As previously stated, he was more or less a failed doctor. His success in the classroom didn't translate to success in the real world. He tried to become a doctor. It was almost an ambition from one of the parents that he had, but he just showed no interest in it. He was practically failing his medical exams on purpose. But although he was very intelligent, so that would mean that he would have had anatomical knowledge. And it's really how that sets up a series of events. Francis Thompson is also a failed priest. He tried to get into the priesthood, couldn't do it. He was in the army for a brief time. You could even say that he was a failed soldier. He has these failed career plans, and he actually ends up being what we would call a quality control inspector at a factory that made surgical instruments and medical instruments. So not only does he have anatomical knowledge, he would have been exposed to all types of scalpels, knives, blades, and perhaps had an understanding of them. I mean, he's the person who's inspecting them to make sure that there's no problem with that. And you have this guy who is more or less, let's say, for all intents and purposes, a drug addict who is dealing with some very intense emotional abuse in the past, physical abuse in the past, and he is also looking at society in a way that he is just not able to be part of them. I mean, there's so many serial killer tendencies that you would see with Francis Thompson, but a big issue is, I mean, let's get away from just basic profiling for a second. Not all people who have these types of experiences go on to become serial killers. Usually there's a genetic or neurological reason to do so, just because they were victims of bullying or they were beaten by someone at boarding school, or because they were not able to get their career on track. They don't go on to become serial killers. So I'm just throwing that out there. But all of these elements come into play about how you have this guy who's living in England, and I'm going off of memory, but I believe Richard Patterson stated that he lived 18 kilometers from Whitechapel. And Whitechapel would, of course, been a place where people could commit crimes and easily sneak around through the alleyways, or just kind of disappear rather easily, which is how Jack the Ripper didn't get caught. And he has all of those psychological elements just in place that could very well be interpreted as that of being a serial killer. And Francis Thompson, though, this is another thing that, I mean, I just have to talk about the contradictions in his belief system. Again, going off of memory, but he was also having an affair with a prostitute at the same time that the Whitechapel murders took place. And it's not even simply that I think that. I remember in one of the interviews with Richard Patterson, he was talking about how in 1965, someone wrote a biography of Francis Thompson, and they even just said that what a remarkable coincidence that this guy, this poet Francis Thompson, was having an affair with a prostitute at the same time that Jack the Ripper was murdering these women in Whitechapel in 1888. So I think with Francis Thompson, there are lots of psychological elements that would indicate that he could have been a serial killer. He perhaps would have had the brain for being Jack the Ripper. Let's look at some skeptical challenges. All of that is profiling. All of that is just making a bunch of educated guesses as to how and why he was thinking. And I know I said it once, but I'll state it again. Just because someone has had those life experiences, it does not mean that they go on to become a serial killer. The second point, this is one that I've talked about a lot on the Jack the Ripper reports and Ripper Wednesday, and I don't know if it's the best point, but some people insist that Jack the Ripper was not English, which Francis Thompson was, that he was foreign and or Jewish. And this is based on just the possible, very, very glimpse-like eyewitness sightings of Jack the Ripper that he was foreign and or Jewish. I said I'd never liked that point because I just don't think that you can look at somebody in the dark for a split second and know whether or not they were Jewish. I know they're trying to look at their facial features and so on, but I don't think that can be done with any type of reasonable accuracy. Now, maybe recognizing certain ethnic features is not impossible, but to know specifically that this person was Jewish or not, it would sort of be like looking at somebody and knowing definitively that they were French or Italian or something like that. Maybe you could make some type of possible guess or something like that, but I don't think that it can be done that extremely with that extreme calculation, but I just wanted to include that in there. And also, I think that some people are suspecting that Jack the Ripper might have actually lived much closer to Whitechapel than the 18 kilometers, that he was actually living in Whitechapel at the time, and he was one of the residents in the overcrowded part of England. That's just another psychological element that people are throwing in. And then there are also people out there that just think that Jack the Ripper might not have had any real medical knowledge or anything. And one of them is Patricia Cornwell, who talked about this very clearly when she was promoting her Jack the Ripper suspect, Walter Sickert. Another one of the most fascinating Jack the Ripper suspects. Walter Sickert was a famous artist. And she just said that, she did a reenactment of this in a documentary when she's just pointing out that Jack the Ripper was perhaps just stabbing the women, and he does remove organs from the bodies of women, but doesn't necessarily mean he had anatomical knowledge. He's just stabbing the women, cutting their bodies open, and just grabbed the first thing that he could grab when he put his hands inside there. Terrible, terrible things. But that is something that I want to include, so that could be interpreted either way. I think that there are a lot of psychological markers that could indicate that Francis Thompson was indeed Jack the Ripper, but something about that religious contradiction is one that really pushed me the wrong way. But I did want to include a poem from Francis Thompson. Longtime Black Box Online Radio listeners will know that I used to do the Jack the Ripper report and conclude the episodes with a poem, usually from Francis Thompson, but sometimes from Lewis Carroll, another poet and writer who went on to become a Jack the Ripper suspect. And this one is called To Monica Thought Dying. You, O pietous you, who all the long night through anticipatedly disclose yourself to me, already in the ways beyond our human comfortable days, how can you deem what death saith to me who listening wake for your poor sake? When a grown woman dies, you know we think unceasingly what things she said, how sweet and how wise, and these do make our misery. But you were, you to me, the dead, anticipatedly. You 11 years, was it not, or so, were just a child, you know, and you never said things sweet immediately, and wise to interdict from closure my wet eyes, but foolish things my dead, little and laughable, your age that fitted well, and was it such things all unmemorable? Was it such things could make me sob all night for your implacable sake? And yet, as you said to me, in pretty make-believe of reveille, so the night long said death, with his malignant breath, and that remembered laughter, which in our daily uses followed after, was all untuned to pity and to awe. A cup of chocolate, 1 farthing is the rate, you drink it through a straw. How could I know how those laughing words, when so drenched with sobbing so, another voice than yours he hath, my dear, wasn't his breath, his mighty utterance, yet he saith, this dreadful death, to his own dreadfulness, doth dreadful wrong, this dreadful childish babble on his tongue, that iron tongue made to speak sentences, and wisdom insupportably complete. Why should it only say the long night through, in mimicry of you, a cup of chocolate, 1 farthing is the rate, you drink it through a straw, a straw, a straw, a straw, oh, of all sentences piercingly incomplete. Why did you teach that fatal mouth to draw, child impressive, impermissible awe, from your old trivialness? Why have you done me this most unsustainable wrong, and into death's control betrayed the secret places of my soul? And when I would read the poems of Francis Thompson on the Jack the Ripper reports, I would say, all right, yeah, I take back everything. This guy was definitely a serial killer. And I would say that half as a joke or half as being satirical, but also, genuinely meaning he does talk about some very morbid things in his poetry. And when you look at what Simon Webb has put forward in the book, Jack the Poet was Francis Thompson, Jack the Ripper, what he's talking about is those aren't baseless things. Those aren't things that are just coming out of the imagination from nowhere. This is a guy who was mostly closed off from people, cut off from other people. He had siblings who were older than him, but they passed away. He was the oldest of his siblings to survive childhood and childbirth, plural. So he has this type of disconnection, and he also is someone who doesn't form a lot of good relationships with people, both in his youth and in his early adulthood. And then he goes on to become the victim of physical abuse, mental abuse, bullying, and it's not only that he is bullied by these quote-unquote tormentors, it's the fact that he doesn't understand why they are doing this to him. He is beaten and caned when he's at the boarding school. He is someone who cannot find success and use his intelligence to achieve, well, greatness in the workplace. He has multiple failed careers. He is someone who is more or less what we would call a gifted underperformer or a gifted underachiever, mostly like a gifted underachiever. But then he is discovered because of his ability to write poems and essays very well. As I said, really, it's his prose that attracts people to him. And they even say this in the book. Like in Simon Webb's book, he talks about how he was more recognized for his prose early on, but then he is more remembered for his poetry. And I think his poetry is excellent. Pending that he was not a serial killer. If he was indeed Jack the Ripper, I would say, forget that stuff. This guy is a serial killer. But just looking at it on itself, yes, it's dark. Yes, it's sad. But when you explore literary art forms like that, you get to experience emotions. But what do you think about Francis Thompson as a Jack the Ripper suspect? I look forward to talking about part 2 of Simon Webb's book, Jack the Poet Was Francis Thompson, Jack the Ripper, next week on Ripper Wednesday. If you like this episode, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. You can also go through some of the links in the description box. One of them is for BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. That's all for me now. Until next time.